Hey, fifth graders, it's Mrs. Seals back for our next science lab. So the past couple weeks, we've been talking about changes to Earth's surface. We talked about sedimentary rock formation. We talked about fossil fuel formation. This week, we're going to be talking about how changes to the Earth's surface occur from weathering, erosion, and deposition caused by wind, water, and ice. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be specifically focusing on how three different landforms, sand dunes, canyons, and deltas are created. However, we are going to spend some time reviewing those terms, weathering, erosion, and deposition. You did learn about weathering in third and fourth grade, and then last year in fourth grade, you also learned about erosion and deposition. I do want to make sure we all understand what those three words mean and the difference between them. So we're going to review those first. Then we will go into how sand dunes, canyons, and deltas are formed and what they are. So your target says I can recognize how landforms such as canyons, deltas, and sand dunes are the result of changes to Earth's surface by wind, water, or ice. So if you were here last year in fourth grade, I taught you this saying to help you remember the difference between weathering, erosion, and deposition because they are not the same thing. A lot of people, even grown-ups, confuse weathering and erosion with each other and they think that they mean the same thing. They are similar and they are related, but they are different. So the saying goes like this: weathering breaks it, erosion takes it, deposition makes it. Say that with me. Ready? Weathering breaks it, erosion takes it, deposition makes it. If you can remember the saying, it will help you remember the difference between those three processes and what's happening during them. So let's talk about weathering first. Hopefully you remember that weathering is the breaking down and wearing away of rock. So this is either when rocks are broken into smaller pieces that we call sediment, or it could be when rocks are kind of worn down, like their shape is changed maybe from water flowing over them, for a very long time. So that brings me to something I want to add in really quickly, which is that remember that these are slow changes. These are not changes that happen overnight or even in a couple of years. They, take a very long time, hundreds or thousands or even millions of years to happen, depending on what the change is. So weathering can be caused by four agents: water, wind, ice, or mechanical weathering, which we'll talk about what that is in just a second. So let's talk about how water causes weathering. This is what I was talking about, where this isn't necessarily rocks being broken, but this is their size and shape being changed and being smoothed out. Streams or rivers flowing over rocks over many, many years causes them to change size and shape. These rocks tend to be smoother. If you've ever gone swimming at a river or a stream where the water is moving and flowing, you might have noticed that the rocks that are at the bottom tend to be a lot smoother. That's because of the water that's been flowing over them for many years. Also, waves crashing into rocks can cause them to wear away over a long period of time as well. Weathering can also be caused by wind. This creates a rock formation, or this creates a landform called a rock arch. These are pictures of rock arches. If you've ever been to Utah, Arizona, Nevada, California, Colorado, different states like that in the West where the soil tends to be sandier, you might have seen these. A lot of people think that these formations are man-made, like an artist went out there and kind of carved it, but these are actually made naturally. And this is weathering caused by wind. Wind causes weathering by blowing bits of material against cliffs and large rocks. This wears away and breaks the rock down into sand and dust. So this is kind of like if you rub sandpaper on something, you know how it smooths it out and kind of changes its shape. That's what's happening here. In places where the soil is very sandy, the wind picks up the sand and blows it up against these large rocks and cliffs. And over time, again, remember, not a fast change, this kind of carves and smooths out the rocks and creates the rock arches. Weathering caused by ice, this is called ice wedging. When water sinks into cracks in a rock and the temperature drops low enough, the water freezes into ice. And when water freezes, it expands, and this creates wedges in the rock that can split the rock into smaller fragments. So here's a little diagram showing you that. And when this happens over and over again, it can cause the rock to break apart. And then mechanical weathering is called root wedging, and it's a similar concept as the ice, but this is when plant roots work their way into rock crevices, and as they grow, the roots create pressure on the sides of the crack, enlarging it until the rock breaks apart. So if you've ever seen a sidewalk that looks like this before, that's an example of root wedging. The roots of the tree are literally growing through the sidewalk and breaking it apart. Erosion. So that was weathering. Let's move on to erosion. Erosion is the process by which weathered material is moved by wind, water, or ice. So remember our saying, weathering breaks it, erosion takes it. So this is when the sediments or the small pieces of rock are moved and carried away. And this can happen from wind, water, or ice. So erosion caused by wind, this is when the wind picks up the sand and moves it, or the sediment and moves it. This creates a landform called a sand dune, which is one of the ones we're going to show today. A sand dune is a mound of sand that is formed by the wind, usually along the beach or desert. So of course it has to be in a place where there's a lot of sand. Sand dunes form when wind blows sand into a sheltered area behind an obstacle. So that means there might, when this sand dune originally started forming, thousands and thousands of years ago, there was an obstacle. There was something in the way. Maybe it was a tree, maybe it was a bush, maybe it was a rock that kind of blocked the sand. And as the wind picked it up and carried it, it kind of was stopped by that obstacle and then began to pile up. And we'll see that in a minute. We're gonna actually model how sand dunes are formed. So when you think about a sand dune, you need to remember it was formed by wind erosion. Erosion can also be caused by water. This creates a landform called a canyon. A canyon is a deep, narrow valley with steep sides. So this is a picture of the Grand Canyon, which is the largest canyon, I know for sure, in North America. It may be the world, but don't quote me on that. I'll look it up. So at the bottom of a canyon, there's water flowing, a river, like in the Grand Canyon, it's the Colorado River. And as the river is moving and flowing, it picks up pieces of sediment and carries it with it and moves that sediment. So again, this is not a fast change. This is a change that has been happening for millions and millions of years. So as the water picks up and moves the sediment with it, it creates that canyon and it causes it to become deeper and wider. And we will also see canyon formation here in just a minute. Erosion caused by ice happens from glaciers. If you were here last year in 4th grade, we did an experiment with glaciers to show how they cause erosion. So a glacier is a giant, basically, block of compacted snow that's now a solid block of ice that moves slowly through the land. And as they move, sediment is picked up and frozen to the bottom or the sides of the glacier. And gets carried away by the flowing ice. And this creates a landform called a U-shaped valley. So remember, a valley is an area between mountains or hills. They're normally more V-shaped, but when they've been created by a glacier, they're more of a U-shaped shape. That's why we call it a U-shaped valley. So if you see U-shaped valley, you need to think glacier. Also, they can create another landform called a fjord, which is a river that runs through a U-shaped valley. So it's basically a U-shaped valley that's been filled up with water and now has a very deep river in it. All right, and then that brings us to deposition. which is the process by which weathered and eroded material is deposited or dropped off by wind, water, or ice. This creates a landform called a delta. So that's easy to remember: deposition, delta. A delta is a landform created by deposition of sediment that is carried by a river. This occurs where a river enters an ocean, sea, lake, estuary, reservoir, or another river that cannot carry away the supplied sediment. So remember when we were talking about the canyons, I told you how the river is picking up and carrying the sediment and moving it along with it. Eventually, the river is going to get to a place where that's going to stop. Maybe the water isn't flowing fast enough. It's not deep enough to continue to carry the sediment, so that the river is going to drop off or deposit the sediment. So you can see in this picture, the river was flowing, and then when it gets here, it can't continue to carry the sediment anymore. So the sediment has been dropped off and created this formation called a delta. All right, so we're also going to see a delta in our experiment right now too. So we're going to do an experiment to observe how sand dunes, canyons, and deltas are formed. So in order to do this, I am using, this is called a stream table. It's a science tool that we use to show weathering, erosion, and deposition and landforms. And in it, instead of using soil, I'm using something called cornmeal, which is used for making like cornbread or corn muffins. It's used in cooking a lot. It's basically like ground up corn. And this is going to represent our land and our soil. So we're going to show how sand dunes, canyons, and deltas are formed through weathering, erosion, and deposition. The reason I'm using cornmeal instead of actual soil or sand is because it shows the process better. I think the pieces are a little bit lighter than sand or soil, so it shows this process easier since we cannot, observe these actual changes happening in the science lab in a short amount of time. We're making a model of them. All right, so I'm going to model sand dune formation first. Remember, sand dunes are formed from wind erosion. Wind picks up sand and carries it. And then when there's an obstacle in the way, maybe a tree, a bush, a large rock, something blocking the sand, it's going to eventually pile up behind that object and create basically a mound of sand. So I'm going to use a rock. That's going to be like my obstacle. Hopefully you will be able to see this. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to use a straw and I'm going to gently blow through the straw into the cornmeal. And you're going to see me blowing through the straw, that's the wind. And it's going to pick up the cornmeal. And when it hits this rock, that's the obstacle in the way, it's going to start to pile up. Okay, so just watch right now. I'll kind of turn this. I think I'm going to move my rock a little bit closer so I don't have to blow so hard. Okay, so I'm going to pause right there so I don't get out of breath. So you can see that as the wind is picking up the cornmeal, when it's hitting this rock, it's starting to pile up against this rock right here. So if I were to continue, which I might for a little bit longer, you're going to see more and more of it start to pile up. And eventually it's going to form kind of a mound or a hill of the sand, or in this case, cornmeal. But in real life, we know it would be sand. All right, so see it? It's continuing to be picked up by the wind and carried, and when it hits this obstacle in its way, it's starting to pile up right there in front of the rock. If I were to keep going, which I'm not, you would see it continue to pile up and up and up, creating that kind of mound or hill made of sand called a sand dune. All right, so our next one is going to show how canyons and deltas are formed. We're going to do this one together because canyons are created by water erosion. Remember, as the water or the river kind of flows through the canyon, it's picking up, or it flows through the space between the cliffs or the mountains. It's picking up sediment and carrying it with it, and kind of cutting away at the canyon, making it wider and deeper. And then eventually when that river stops flowing, you are going to see the delta as the sediment gets deposited, and it actually is going to be kind of extending the land out. So hopefully this works. Hopefully you can see. I have a cup here with a hole in it, and a hole in the bottom, and I'm going to put it right here and slowly pour water into it, and you're going to see, let me pile this up, you're going to see that canyon formation. You're going to see the water picking up the sediment and carrying it. That's the erosion. And then when it stops moving, you're going to see it be deposited to create that delta. All right, so here we go. Hopefully I don't make a mess. Hopefully this works. I think what I need to do is raise this up. There we go. All right, so you can already see some erosion happening. The water is picking up the cornmeal, which is our sediment, as it's flowing through, and it's carrying it with it. I don't know if you can see, oh, there was a big piece. All the sediment that's moving down right here, that's all erosion. It's being moved by the water. All right, let me let this finish, and then I'll show you what our canyon looks like and our delta. There's a lot of sediment being picked up and moved. Hopefully you can see that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop. Whoops. I'm going to go ahead and stop and show this to you. So right here is our canyon that was created from our water erosion. As our water or our river was flowing through here, it was picking up the sediment and moving it. That's water erosion. Then it's a little bit harder to see the delta, but do you see how this sediment has been deposited along the way? Like this sediment wasn't here earlier. It was deposited by the water as the water was moving. That's starting to create a delta. It's extending the land out, For some reason, when the river was moving and flowing, something stopped it. It couldn't continue to carry some of the sediment anymore. So then it kind of dropped some sediment off along its way, extending the land out and creating that formation called a delta. All right, so I hope that you had fun learning about weathering, erosion, deposition, and sand dunes and canyons and deltas. And I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.